Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Fox. I'm the artistic director of Clarion Music Society, and our educational week continues with this panel discussion on music from past pandemics. Welcome to all of you who are joining us for the first time for this panel discussion, or those of you who are coming straight from our violin masterclass, which just ended with Cynthia Roberts. Thank you for joining us for any and all of these events throughout the week. Continues through Saturday. But I'm so delighted that we could have a chance to speak with four renowned scholars about music during past pandemics. I think it gives us such a great perspective on what we're going through now, particularly as we try to come out of this pandemic and as live performances come back. And we're so lucky to have four wonderful people who have areas of specialty that are slightly different. So I think they'll all have different perspectives, and I'd like to introduce them. Nora Beck is with us from Lewis and Clark University. And Nora just published a book on Boccaccio and the invention of musical narrative. So she'll be talking about music specifically in the Decameron and during the Black Plague in 14th century Italy. So we're really looking forward to that. We have with us Carrie McCarthy, who is a wonderful singer that I've worked with and also a marvelous scholar. She's written books on English Tudor composers such as Byrd and Tallis, and so she'll be talking about English music from the Tudor period. We have with us James Johnson from Boston University, and he'll be looking at Venice in the years 1575 to 1630, and specifically at the music of Monteverdi. And we have with us Gregory Johnston from the University of Toronto. And Professor Johnston will be talking to us about Schutz's great work, the Musikalische Exequien, and German ideas on mortality in general during Schutz's period, the first part of the 17th century. So we'll begin by hearing from all four of our guests individually. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to let all four of them speak in succession, and then we'll open it up. I'll start it off with a couple of questions of my own, and then I'd love to see any questions that you may have. You can put it right in the chat, and I'll see it there. We're thinking this will be a little bit over an hour, around an hour, but we may go until a little past 8:30, may go till 8:45 if the conversation is still really intriguing, as I know it will be at that point. So Nora, let's begin with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen and Lauren and everyone for this wonderful invitation. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, and I've been teaching the entire semester in front. And one of the things I thought right away when I started teaching is that I know something about plagues. I know something about music and the plague from my work with the Decameron. I spent a lot of time in the 14th century in Italy looking art, literature, and seeing the way that they all interact. And Boccaccio's Decameron, of which you have an image here, was written, the introduction is one of the best narratives of what it was like to live through the Black Plague. And in it, he specifically talks about music. And he tells us that this group of 7 women and 3 men, they've lost everyone in their families, and they get together in the church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. And they look at each other and say, what are we going to do? They've all died. And Boccaccio explains that during that period, some groups, families, stayed inside to stay away, and they listened to music. Some groups went outside, and they partied, and they played a lot of music. And then there was somebody who had a middle ground. They would sometimes go out and then return back to the home and play some music. Well, what is clear is that they believed that music, good food, nature was a way that they could use to survive. And so these people decide, hey, we're going to just get out of town. We're going to go into the countryside and we're going to spend our time playing music and falling in love and telling stories. Now, there was a doctor back then in the 14th century, and his name was Giovanni del Garbo. And he does talk about, he says that, in fact, being in a garden. Here you can see the aristocrats sitting in a garden, being with your friends, and they have musical instruments, and they live a tempered life, can ward off death. Here is death on this side. So in the 14th century, they understood that balance and that music in harmony was a reflection of this balance. So when I was teaching my students, I thought I would tell them that the other thing that the Decameron tells us is that Boccaccio would envision what it would be like after the plague. And he explained that when you're in this terrible time, it was like going slowly up a mountain where you don't know how tall the mountain is and you don't know how steep, but we know that on the other side is something magnificent. So that's how they dealt in the 14th century. They stayed in gardens. And if you couldn't get to a garden because you didn't have the money, because in these images we have aristocrats, some of them have servants, they're dancing. You could imagine, they imagine these gardens. So this is a picture in Santa Maria Novella. Here are the aristocrats in the garden, enjoying their company. And this one is more of a sacred picture because here the garden is even a path toward getting into heaven. So if you could live a tempered life, balance, and the right kind of music, and I'm talking about secular music now, then if you understood those earthly delights, then you too could reach heaven. And here we have these images. This is a very interesting one. This is Jotto in the Scroveny chapel in Padua. Now here is justice, and she has her scales, and here is injustice. Notice that underneath justice, there are women dancing and singing. Same that we've had before. So that was very clear to the 14th century mind that balance, harmony equals justice. And when everything is out of order, when nature grows too fast, then underneath these musicians who were once dancing here are assaulted and they're dragged away. This has a lot of implications, I think, for our world as well, because music was central to the way of thinking about good government. In a government that works, that has justice, there is music. And where there's injustice, there is no music. But Dante talks about this, of course, there's no music in hell, and music comes back. So then the question is, what did the music sound like? So we saw some images, we read a little bit. What was a typical kind of piece they listened to? Well, in the Decameron, he talks about ballatas, which are dance songs. So this is a famous example. Now, it doesn't actually exist in the Decameron, but this is the kind of music that these people would have listened to. It's anonymous, and it's a beautiful song called Per troppo fede. is a 14th century monodic ballata, one-line ballata. You can see that even the cover uses the same image that I showed you before. Here, the aristocrats in the garden, sultry. They're thinking about, what's interesting about this painting, it's in Pisa. If you ever get to go to Pisa, it's in the Camposanto. It has 7 women and 3 men, and it was painted prior to the Decameron. So we think that Boccaccio did a painting with this musical event, may have even inspired the writing of that piece. I wanted to play you one more little bit. So first we had the monodic, that is one line, called ballata. And then later on in the century, you start having polyphonic pieces. This one is by Landini. It's called Here is la Primavera, ecco, here is spring. So here's another example of the kind of music that they listen to. One thing that ties this music together is the sense of the outdoors, this pastoral quality that a lot of the secular music had, and that was a way. Be outside, be in nature, live a balanced life, and you will give yourself a better chance of surviving this plague of 1348, the Black Plague that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Florence. I'll stop there. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to Dr. McCarthy's talk.
Thank you, Nora. That was absolutely lovely. I'll just go ahead and share my screen now and take us into 16th century London. So this is a drawing of London made in the mid-16th century. You can see there are lots of churches, which means lots of music, lots of composing, and of course, lots of singing. At this point, about 1 out of every 50 literate people in England was a paid church musician of some kind. About 1 out of every 50 literate people. And in London, that number was even higher. So here we are in the mid-1550s in the time of Tallis, and there's just been some serious change going on for musicians because they have a new queen, a Catholic queen, and the whole country has just decided to throw out the Reformation and return to traditional musical practice in Latin with all the older styles of music. And this happened so suddenly that some musicians decided to rent new music books instead of buying them. It's the earliest case I've ever found of professionals renting music in England. They didn't know how long this new regime would last, and the rules just kept changing. In the middle of this, England was hit by what people were calling the new sickness. And historians have generally called this a flu epidemic. It was some sort of quite nasty new respiratory virus. It came over from France, and it lasted about 2 years, 1557 and 1558. One witness at the time said about 1/3 of the people in England caught it to some degree. Another witness said that it killed a lot of distinguished men and was somewhat easier on women. Another witness said it was especially hard on priests. Now that's a group that would have been somewhat older, obviously all male, and somewhat more sedentary and better fed than the general population. So this disease seems to have been quite COVID-like in that sense. And during these 2 years, 1557 and 1558, the death rate of adults in England was more than twice the normal rate. We can tell that from the number of wills that went through probate, that were carried out. And we can learn a lot about musicians from the wills they wrote. Tudor musicians tended not to write too much about themselves until they started preparing their legacies, and then all of a sudden you find out all about their families and their social circles and their colleagues. And these wills are also a good place to look for the immediate effects of disease. For example, there were 2 composers in London, Nicholas Ludford and John Shepherd, who both died during this epidemic. Both their wills were completed and revised in a bit of a hurry, in a way that you don't normally see with well-established musicians. Ludford's will wasn't finalized until 4 days before he was buried, and Shepherd's will is just a bit garbled here and there. But with Shepherd, we can still hear a very strong character in the document. We can hear a very strong voice. He says he wants to be buried in Westminster Abbey with a monument, like you do when you're a great artist. Request denied, unfortunately. He ended up in the little parish church next door, St. Margaret's, Westminster, where he was a parishioner and where his older colleague, Ludford, who also died in this pandemic, was buried the year before. John Shepherd really was quite a composer, and he seems to have known it. He had a bit of a history of bragging about his own importance. And I'm going to play a short clip from one of his works, Libera nos, salva nos, or in English, Set Us Free, Save Us. This is an incredibly rich little piece in 7-part harmony, 7-part polyphony. The low bass part is what we're looking at here, and it's a simple chant melody in steady notes, mostly breves. Then the 6 upper parts make this elaborate filigree above it. And here's one of the top parts. Let's start listening where it comes in. You can follow it. The choirs who sang this stuff in the 1550s seem to have made things work pretty well, despite the challenges. At the end of this epidemic, a few singing groups in London ended up a little bit smaller, a few ended up a little bit bigger. Most of them ultimately stayed about the same size. And it's interesting to study the new sickness in the 1550s because it's fascinating to see how Tudor musicians dealt with what you might call a moderate level pandemic. In 16th century England, there were also outbreaks of bubonic plague, which Nora was discussing. Musical groups dealt with that in a much more severe way. For example, at Magdalen College, Oxford, where Shepherd was the director of music before he came to London, they sent all the boy choristers home for half a year, 2 different times. Just go home for 6 months because of bubonic plague. Henry VIII sent all of his chapel singers home when the plague came to his court, because he explicitly did not want a lot of people around him. Here is the chapel that Henry VIII built at St. James's Palace. And now here is basically what it would look like when every single one of his chapel singers and choristers and clergy were in attendance. Henry did not want to be in that room, so he put the whole chapel royal on leave, and the only musician he had stay with him during the plague was his organist. But this really wasn't happening so much in churches in London during the 2 years that I've been studying. The only staff shortages and absences you hear about are priests, are clergy, but not musicians. Church music went right on being a crucial part of the social fabric of the city. And in fact, there was more singing going on during these 2 years, because there were twice as many funerals. And remember, this was also during the brief period when the full Catholic funeral services were restored, which meant a lot of music. And finally, here's a little piece of funeral pomp that has survived from those years. This is the funeral pall, a piece of embroidered cloth used by the Guild of Brewers in London to cover the person's coffin while the service was being sung. You can see the beautiful embroidery of little wheat sheaves, and on the little scrolls, you can see words, you can see text. It says, Sancte Deus. This is just one little detail. The text goes on around all 4 sides. And this was a text set to music by John Shepherd himself in a very beautiful piece called Media Vita, or in English, In the Midst of Life, We Are in Death. So very much grappling with our common mortality. And I'll finish by playing the little bit we can see here. Thank you all so much for being here and sharing this.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McCarthy, for that beautiful presentation. The topic is Music and the Plague in Venice. After the appearance of the Black Death in Europe in the 1340s, there were two major outbreaks in Venice. The period 1575 through 77, and then again the period 1630 to 31. I'd like to talk about how music was used in both of these outbreaks, but my focus will be especially on the second period. I say, since the 1340s, these two outbreaks were among more than 25 outbreaks in the city of Venice, but these were the worst. In the first of these outbreaks, 45,000 people died in 2 years, that's to say, a quarter of the population. In the second of these outbreaks, 1630 and 1631, the toll was nearly 65,000. That is to say, 1 in every 3 Venetians died. The experience of death was palpable, and it was personal in ways that we can scarcely imagine. What we will see here is an image of, in fact, the plague in Milan, and we're looking at the main square in the city of Milan. We see these two monumental pillars as our eyes move through this print. We see in the far left the city gate. And as we look at that gate, we also grasp that there is movement toward the gate. We can see carts, people pulling the carts, horses pulling the carts. And then, of course, we grasp that these are carts with human bodies. And we see those looking out, calling out. We see people running in the street. We see people exclaiming in the street. We see the depiction of panic. This is a description of the 1575 plague by a Venetian who survived. He writes, "The plague continued, killing more people with every hour that passed, and every day inspiring greater terror and deeper compassion for its poor infected victims. Onlookers wept as these people were carried down to their doors by their sons, fathers, and mothers, and there in the public eye their bodies were stripped naked and shown to the doctors to be assessed. I myself had to carry down 3 whom I had lost, my mother, my brother, and a nephew. Many, driven to frenzy by the disease, especially at night, leapt from their beds, shouting with the fearful voices of damned souls, went here and there, colliding with one another, and suddenly falling to the ground, dead. Some who rushed in frenzy out of the wards threw themselves into the water or ran madly through the gardens and were found dead among the thorn bushes, all covered with blood. Then, as now, there was a strong urge to find those to blame for the disease, including foreigners, vagabonds, and also the educated, physicians and pharmacists. This, by the way, is a map of Venice. I see the inscription is not fully visible. Jacopo di Barbara, view of Venice. This is from about 1500. The unpopulated islands that surround the main part of Venice, where you fight the disease and the dying, the largest of these had as many as 10,000 sick people at one time. People looked for portents and signs. They looked to the skies for comets and meteors, mysterious fires in the city that suddenly started. Some said there were fires in the skies itself. Some in Venice initially denied the presence of the plague, or they diminished its deadliness. Officials begged with the population to take it seriously. But the more common response than seeking scapegoats was for the population and government officials to blame themselves. They saw the plague as the punishment of an angry God for collective sin. And therefore, At every major outbreak, there were prayers, religious services, processions, all of them accompanied by music. This was the effort of the government and of the population to atone for the sins that had brought God's terrible wrath. And in each of these two plagues, there was a commitment by the government to build major churches as part of this expiation. In the first of these two major outbreaks, the Doge authorized the construction of a votive church. This is the Church of the Sacred Redeemer, otherwise known as Eleonora. It was begun in 1576, and it was built as an atonement and also as a plea. And then when the second plague came in 1630, the Senate commissioned the Church of Santa Maria della Salute. Salute, in this case, being associated with health or with well-being. The senators explicitly included in this legislation that this building would be a prayer to the Blessed Mary to intercede with Christ on behalf of the city of Venice, to petition to God to end the plague, just as God had done in 1577. Both of these dedications included public masses in different churches. They included processions. They included singing. They included prayer. As we speak about procession, famous procession, at least in the visual memory of Venice, is this beautiful painting by Gentile Bellini. And this is the procession of the True Cross in Piazza San Marco. We see this 1496, and we see just the seriousness of the ceremony. And what we see here under the canopy in this ornate gold-encrusted receptacle is a portion people thought that it was of the True Cross. It had recently moved from Jerusalem to Venice. And if we can imagine a procession like this now, for the two plagues that I've described, with this icon rather than that gold-encrusted receptacle under the canopy, this is the so-called Madonna Nicopaea. It's a Byzantine icon that was made in the 9th through the 10th century. It was an icon that Byzantine emperors carried with them into battle, and thus the name of this, the bearer of victory. And this was considered in Venice at the time the most sacred icon of the city. This was an icon that was brought out only in the rarest and most urgent occasions. It was carried from church to church, eventually to come to the altar of San Marco, and eventually the procession led into the Basilica of San Marco. And this is what we're looking at now, a procession in the 80s. And we see leading the procession into the Basilica are the musicians. We can look at this a little bit more closely, and we see musicians. We can even make out the pifferi, the wind instruments. We can make out the tromboni, the brass instruments. And then following them, we have the Doge and the senators and the other important men in the government. In 1630, there were processions like this using the Madonna icon. In fact, in 1630 alone, there were 15 different processions through the city, always held on Saturdays, ending up at different churches. Among these 15 were processions to the location of where this church would be built. These two processions, the first was for the laying of the stone on this site, April 1630, and the second recognition of the end of the plague. This was November 21st, 1631, and here we see, in fact, an image of that very ceremony. We see the people flooding into the church, and what we can imagine now looking at the modern photograph is boats aligned side by side going across the Grand Canal so that people could walk from the environs of the Piazza San Marco, not far from that opening we see across from Santa Maria della Salute. They would literally walk on the water, that's to say across the boats, and make their way. This Mass, held on November 21st, 1631, was a Mass of thanksgiving to God for the deliverance from the plague. It was officially declared ended. And at the center of the Mass was music, and at the center of music was this man, Claudio Monteverdi, who had come to Venice from Mantua as the director of all musical activities in San Marco. He was at the center, certainly, of this procession. In fact, he was in charge of all of the music in this and other processions in the 1630 plague. And to this collection that assembled this collection that a number of you perhaps know of, the Selva Morale e Spirituale. Selva, literally a very rich word, meaning you could say collection or assemblage, but in fact you also think about Dante's Selva Oscura, when he found himself in the midst of a dark wood. So selva, wood, can also mean a kind of disarranged hodgepodge, as it means in Dante. Well, this is what Monteverdi wrote, and he collected small and large scale pieces, most of them written during this plague, most of them having to do with the plague. They were a hybrid of psalms and hymns, small scale works, and surviving now one of the two large scale movements that he wrote as well. That is to say, the Gloria, which survives now. There was a credo also sung in Thanksgiving, the solemn mass, possibly other movements that have been lost as well. But this is a piece of music that I would like to end with as we listen to part of this Gloria. And this is an immense scale. This is a movement that itself, depending on the performance, can last up to 14 minutes. This is a movement that's written for a 7-part chorus, and of course strings and winds as well. Certainly these immense forces are suited to the occasion of Thanksgiving. And in fact, we hear in the opening of this soaring grandeur. We hear dazzling layered effects of the voices as they enter. We hear perhaps tremendous joy and gratitude. We hear this as a celebration. And I would also say, without knowing the context, we might hear it only as a celebration. But what I have to ask myself, and what we have to imagine, is how contemporaries heard it. Imagine that in the last year, you have lost 1 out of every 3 of your neighbors, perhaps 1 out of every 3 of your family members. How would we then? How would we hear it when we had experienced the kind of horror that the survivors describe? At the end of the text, glory to God in the highest, then comes the second part, and peace, goodwill toward all people. Something suddenly shifts in the music at this point. Each instrument, each voice is speaking or singing or playing in the lowest part of its register. The texture is dark. The texture is suddenly solemn. It is peace. It is a peace that has come at a terrible price. And yet it is also the peace of God. We'll listen to a bit of this. I'd like to end with a sentence from another Venetian survivor, describing what he observed on that largest island that could hold as many as 10,000 of the diseased and dying. This is what he wrote. Every evening at the Letteretto Nuovo, as the Ave Maria sounded, the voices of the afflicted could be heard singing psalms and litanies. Una armonia mirabile di diverse voci, a miraculous harmony of multifarious voices. Even with these afflicted in mind, both then and now, mindful of their suffering, mindful of their recovery, mindful of their loss, the same words could be said of this work by Monteverdi, a miraculous harmony of multifarious voices. Thank you.
Thank you, James. There's the references you made to trying to hear things and understand this world in the context of them, rather than how we see them simply as figures, numbers, is something that I find particularly fascinating in trying to reimagine how life must have been. Germany, or Central Europe, differs in some ways from some of the other topics that people have been touching on, in that it is, of course, very staunchly Protestant. And they had plague, they had tuberculosis, they had every possible epidemic and all the diseases one could imagine. Plus, for the first half of the century, the 17th century, of course, there was the 30 Years' War, which in itself communicated disease as well as destroyed complete cities and savaged the land. So the appearance of plague, it comes on and off. It touches in different places, sometimes in the Baltic, sometimes across the center, often along trade routes, often along simply the paths that invading armies chose to take. One instance that later in the century, that perhaps just to give some impression of what this is like, is Erfurt. Well after the war, it's in 1683, where an outbreak of the plague there ended up with casualties or fatalities numbering at 9,500 thereabouts. And that was a city of 16,000 to begin with. So half the population was gone. And of course, this is all in Thuringia. And of course, so in that collection of people that died were members of the Bach family. J.S. Bach was only born less than 60 kilometers away, only 2 years later. So that he survives these sorts of things is a marvel. But what is so different when we look at Lutheran music of this time is it all seems rather serious, and well, it is. Because the difference principally is that, I'm sure that most of you know all this, is that through Luther, one was assured of entry into heaven by faith alone, sola fide. That if you believed in Jesus as your Savior and Redeemer to the moment you died, you would go into heaven. There were no saints that you could pray to. There were no interventions that people could make on your behalf. You either went into heaven or you went to hell. Those were your options. Consequently, Lutherans spent their entire lives obsessing in some ways about being prepared. So not so much reflecting on things that have happened, but on where their soul will be, their immortal soul once they've died. So they often use, as a reference point, a passage from Isaiah, where Isaiah the prophet, son of Amos, came unto him and said, "Thus saith the Lord, set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live." And this idea, of course, also carried on by Luther, who says the same thing. Put your affairs in order, not just your spiritual affairs, but your physical affairs. Have it all in place, because that is what will get you into heaven. Lutherans consequently made a practice of studying the art of death, the Ars Moriendi, the Todesschule. They would study how other Christians had died so that they could emulate them. The idea of printing and publishing funeral sermons was something that everybody studied. There was a Princess Sophia Eleonora zu Stolberg, just kind of rolls off the tongue, had a collection of 40,000 printed funeral sermons that she spent her time studying. Others prepared in all sorts of other ways. They chose the sermonic theme for their funeral. They picked the music for their funeral. They did, of course, their will, but they also sometimes composed their own music. They took this to the extremes of, well, a good mother would prepare burial shrouds for all the members of her family in case she went before they did. All of these sorts of things seems a little bit macabre to us, but by concretely preparing, it also ensured that they were somehow spiritually ready to go at any time, and that's all one needed to do. The piece that I wanted to just kind of mention along these lines is Schutz's Musikalische Exequien. Now, this is a phenomenal piece of music to begin with, and it's written by Heinrich Schütz for the funeral of a fellow who's a lord, low-level member of the nobility, Heinrich Postumus Reuss. Now, Heinrich Reuss was named Postumus because he was born after the death of his father. But the other thing about Heinrich and the Reuss family is that every male in the Reuss family had the name Heinrich. Even Heinrich Postumus's sons were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of them named Heinrich. Schütz was born in the domain of Heinrich Reuss in a small town called Köstritz. Now it's Bad Köstritz, which is just outside of the city of Gera. So although Schütz left that area very early in life, he always maintained strong bonds of loyalty to his homeland and to his lord. So even as Hofkapellmeister, director of music at the Dresden court, the loftiest position for a Protestant musician in all of Europe, he still maintained these bonds. Now, Postumus was, like every good Lutheran, mindful of his own end. And towards his life, as he, suffering various diseases, illnesses, slower to recover each time, he began to draw up his own plans. First of all, picking out the sermonic theme for his funeral, but also other things pertaining to it. But perhaps most striking is that he designed his own coffin. He took a selection of chorale texts and biblical texts, assorted them and organized them in a very wonderful symmetrical way, and had those painted on a copper coffin a year before he died. The coffin itself, he didn't want to disturb his family too much by these kinds of thoughts, so he had it hidden. So his family didn't know that this coffin had been waiting for a year before he died. And when he did, it was used by Schütz, who was commissioned then to write the music, to take these texts one after the other and create a piece of music out of these 13 scriptural texts and 8 chorale texts. It's a spectacular piece of music, the Musikalische Exequien. So Postumus died in December 1635. The funeral was on February 2nd and the 4th. There are 2 different ceremonies, one at the castle, one down in the city. Now it's important to note that the funeral was timed to be on St. Simeon's Day in February, which is the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin Mary, or Candlemas, or St. Simeon's Day, because of its celebration of Simeon in the Gospel according to Luke. And we'll come to this in just a second. So the Musikalische Exequien is 3 pieces. Now, it's a long piece so that we can't spend time looking at the first of these concerti, as he called them. The second is simply a motet setting of the biblical passage used for the sermon. But it's the last movement that I think will perhaps give us a little insight. You can hear it simply as sound, and it is gorgeous. But Schütz writes a preface to the published edition of the composition, and he describes how he wants things done, or what it is meant to be. So in the third of these pieces, it begins with the tenor intonation from Luke. It's the Nunc dimittis, the Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. So, Herr, nun lässest du deinen Diener, which we hear by the tenor, followed by a 5-part choir singing In Frieden fahren, lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. So we hear that, and we can imagine a congregation sitting in a church, this embellished coffin at the front, a choir singing, as no surprise there, to a small portative organ. Now, the thing with the intonation is that Luke, singing this intonation, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, is what Simeon said on that same day, biblically, when he had recognized Jesus as his Savior and salvation, and he was ready to die. So Postumus becomes something of a surrogate of Luke, the ideal Christian ready to die. But Schütz doesn't leave it as that. Shortly into the text, we hear the 5-part choir, and Schütz writes fortiter, strong, make it loud, bold, so we can hear it. After the recitation and that entry of the choir, there's another indication, submisse, a drop in the dynamic level, and here we hear 3 other voices enter one after the other. And they're singing a completely different text, not from Luke, but from Revelation. And their text is, Selig sind die Toten, die in dem Herrn sterben. Blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. Now this trio that enters with this completely different text quietly is called by Schütz the Beata Anima cum Seraphinis, the Blessed Spirit with the seraphim. Now the seraphim, the 2 sopranos, are the highest order of angels. The seraphim are the 6-winged figures that hover around the throne of God and intone his praises with Sanctus, 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 and that for eternity. So these are the 2 sopranos. The other voice in this trio is a bass, or more accurately, a baritone. This is the Beata Anima. And everyone in that church knew that Heinrich Postumus was esteemed for his musicality, but especially for his fine bass voice. So hearing seraphim, hearing Postumus with them as the Beata Anima, projects him directly into the presence of God, logically. But Schütz doesn't leave it at that. He thinks that, first of all, this trio should be in die Ferne geordnet, that this trio should be somewhere else in the church, not at the front with the choir. And he says, and if you have the resources, it will be even more effective if you can duplicate or triplicate that ensemble. So that instead of having just 2 sopranos and a baritone, you would hear another set and then another set, somewhere off in the distance. Now, in 1623, in his history, his Resurrection Historia from 1623, Schütz writes that the interlocutors would be more effective if we didn't see them. And so it's very easy for us to imagine, similarly, that this little trio, the Beata Anima cum Seraphinis, would be somewhere where we don't hear them. That as they enter, they would be behind us, to our right, somewhere else, or perhaps we might hear them progressively moving the length of the church. And all of this is, again, if we imagine ourselves in the situation at that time, distraught, having walked an hour and a half down the mountainside from the castle to the church, to hear these voices appearing from nowhere, and to hear this beloved Lord coming out of this sound. One can imagine that it would take your breath away perhaps a little bit. But Schütz, although he's working for effect, what he's really trying to impress is that Heinrich Postmus was an excellent Christian. He had prepared everything for his death. He had gone to heaven. This is what you also need to do. And we'll find that sort of lesson put forward time and time again in the repertoire. So let's listen to this. Just a 2 minute if I have that. Let's see, up here and share. Okay. Down and. Five-part choir, forty tenor. Here we'll get the new voices. And once the body had been transported to the vault, after all of the silence, all of the bells in all of the churches in the city and all the villages around would start to ring to let everyone know that he had gone to a better place. So, thank you.
Wow, just wonderful. Thank you all. Just beautiful presentations. And I have a question or two I'd love to start off with asking the panel. Given this perspective that you have on past pandemics and the role that music played, Nora, you spoke about the importance of balance in people's lives and how music kind of played a role in that balance. And I think Kerry and James, you both spoke about the importance of music even through the plagues for worship and prayer and the processions. How, by comparison, how did we do in this last pandemic? We're all living either in the United States or Canada. Do you find that music played still an important role over the last year and a half, and as important a role as in the past? And my other question is how technology changed everything for us this last year and a half as well.
Maybe I'll start a little bit with that. Thanks for that great question, and thanks for the wonderful panel. Over the plague, I had a chance to get to know a piece of music by Valerie Coleman. She wrote it for the Philadelphia Orchestra in the middle of the plague, our plague, and it was called 7 O'Clock Shout. And it was written as a way to commemorate all the people, the healthcare workers, who would then drive home at 7 o'clock in the evening. And then we recall, especially in New York City, not so much in Portland, but in New York City, people clapping. And she wrote this very beautiful tone poem as a response. I thought I could play a little bit of it. It reminds me of the Decameron, actually, because it's very pastoral in nature. And it also has another quality that was important in medieval music. It has a call and response quality to it. But here's a little bit of Valerie Coleman's. This is brand new music performed by the Philadelphia Orchestra, 7 o'clock shout. Oh, I have to share. Oh, unfortunately, I have to stop here, but it brings the technology of what people did to get orchestral pieces together, to promote them, and such a great quality also of the recording. So here's one example, brand new, as a result of our pandemic.
You know, I think what we've learned in all these presentations is that music brings people together. And one of the things that was moving to me and to so many of us that this 7 o'clock shout alludes to is people on their own balconies coming out to be together with other people on their balconies and coming out together, banging pans for the service workers and medical professionals. And I think that's one thing that's common. And I wanted to share something that I stumbled across that sent chills down my spine when I was reading for this presentation. It has to do with the plague in Milan again. And this is notated by famous, well-known Cardinal Borromeo of Milan. And Borromeo, according to this scholar, whose book was published 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, Borromeo called it a virtual procession already. Kind of strange. The procession was quarantine in Milan. The church bells to the city would ring and people would come to their windows and they would sing together. Listen to this chronicler. It was a sight to see when all the inhabitants of this populous city, numbering little short of 300,000 souls, united to praise God at one and the same time, sending up together in a harmonious voice of supplication and deliverance from their distress. And the chronicler goes on to say that it was as though it was a cloister in the open air, and just an extraordinary thing that is not unlike what we saw people on their balconies united through music.
I see a question here in the chat. Could the plague of Venice in 1630 be the same one spread to Germany in 1635?
I don't know, Greg, do you know the answer to that question?
I think you may be muted still, Greg.
Sometimes it's better that way. It's really difficult to say how things are communicated. I mean, there's so many little pockets that pop up, and it only takes one person really to come in from somewhere to start an entire epidemic. And so whether somebody comes from, I know that Schwitz had spent time, a lot of Germans had spent time in Venice around this time studying and also absorbing this new style, probably some of the disease as well. And what they take back is really a good question. And because the records are not always very good about how something moves from place to place. The Germans are very good about keeping record of the number of deaths and baptisms and marriages and things like that in their city records. It's quite a literate society. But this sort of thing, guessing how something moves from place to place is something I don't think they did report. So it's anybody's guess.
Yeah.
I have one question. For those, because I'm so immersed in this this Protestant ethic, for those who work in, well, anybody who's working in sort of the Catholic area, how did people cope mentally? Since Protestants could always say, well, by preparing for death, a fellow Ferdinand von Ingen said, by preparing so fastidiously for death, they're actually denying it, because by doing that, they're proving and demonstrating that they're still alive in order to do this. So when I see these processions, these wonderful processions going on, so how are they projecting themselves individually in a post-pandemic world or in a post-life on Earth world, in terms of theology or in any other way?
I do think it was a heavy sense of sin. I think that the population participated in these processions, and those who participated were granted indulgences from sins. And so, if we take it as people genuinely believing this, then I think that there's really a sense of needing to atone. And this is also the period of flagellants, and there were flagellants in these processions as well. So it's a dark view.
Yeah, the sense that I get, certainly reading a lot of these wills of musicians, members of the Guild of Professional Singers in London, and of course the Brewers Guild, who were very busy considering how much beer these folks drank. But reading these wills and these documents, I get a sense of something slightly more positive, that these people, even as they were going into death, they knew they were part of this community. And this community would show up, would sing for them, would pray for them, would put them in this list. I mean, the guilds, including the Singers Guild, right up to the point of the Reformation, had these lists where they would list every single deceased musician, and they had a special day each year when they'd remember them all, have this sort of memorial service. And they could help them. They could pray for their colleagues. They didn't just have to sort of wish them good luck. So yes, it was certainly challenging, but there was also this sense of solidarity between the living and the dead. The sort of the abyss between them could be bridged. It wasn't quite so deep as you might think, or you could see across it through singing, through music, especially.
I'm going to ask another question of all of you. One of the things that we couldn't get to, I'm thinking of the sort of the sonic atmosphere. Now I know that Germans, the idea that organs would always be gedeckt. It would be the soft wooden pipes for funerals. Strings were not generally allowed, except in places like Nuremberg. Trumpets in processions would have mutes put in them, which would dull the sound and drop the tone. And sometimes the clappers on bells would be covered in cloth. Wheels of carts would be covered in cloth. So that they changed the way the world sounded, especially if it was a member of an elector or a member of the high nobility. So I was wondering if, when I see in James's presentation, all of these brass instruments, did anything change in terms of how this sound was? You do mention tessitura and lower sounds, but are there other ways that the sound world was changed on any of these occasions?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I can answer the question. I was surprised to learn that in addition to, and they talk about trombones, the equivalent thereof, but the word trombones, and they talk about artillery, and they talk about bells, and they talk about drums. And so we can imagine before this Monteverde Gloria began, they placed that icon on the altar. there were drums and artillery and brass, and then it began. So, and bells ringing. So I think the sonic world is a lot, you know, in that moment is a lot more clamorous than we imagine so-called classical music.
Even in current funerals or treatment that we see in England, you know, the drums are covered in cloth. I mean, they're muffled. The instruments are muffled. It changes the perception. It makes things seem different somehow, and then changes back to something bright as the real world is reintroduced.
You know, as we come out of this pandemic, I think you addressed this a little bit. How did music change because of these plagues? Carrie, you pointed out that, you know, more or less some choirs got smaller, some choirs got larger, but more or less it was active throughout and it stayed active in England. But I wonder, was it so in all places? And what are your thoughts, therefore, about how the live performances will look now, you know, coming out of this pandemic? Should we expect things based on history to be different in any particular way? Don't all speak at once, please.
Yeah. So certainly historically in these times, it's a great time for, well, in the same as it is now, those who sponsor the arts, those who sponsor music, their focuses may change in the same way that during times of epidemics in early modern Europe anyway, it was also a time for musicians to be furloughed, sometimes to be paid a stipend so that they don't leave the area, but that they would come back sometime. It was a time for musicians also to be moving around, sometimes pilfering musicians from other courts. I'm sorry about this.
Tell them you're busy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nora?
Yeah,
Right.
I have a little different take. This summer, and I don't know if Dr. McCarthy, you were there, but this summer, one of the things that brought out musicians and brought music back into the streets and actually in choirs were the protests that happened in Portland. When I went, we were singing pretty much the entire time. We all were masked, but there could be thousands of people, and we're talking about July about it, and it was an incredibly musical event. I don't think I would have left the safety of my home, except for the fact that I had heard that everybody had gotten together and we were singing, and we were singing in the streets for social justice. Of course, what's interesting is that around 10:30 at night, the police came, and it just became, it evolved into this horrible, very violent situation. But inevitably, every night around 8:30 for a long time, we all started with singing, many, many people singing together.
Wonderful. I see a comment from Allison Cook here. As a modern church musician, I take great comfort in hearing how many church musicians continued making music throughout these plagues across time period and region. Yeah, and I really felt the same way too, hearing your presentations. Barry Marshall asks, were many musicians desperate for work during these plagues? Touches on what you were just saying a little bit, Greg. And did the rich get richer as today? You know, I'll just say, you know, you mentioned musicians moving around. I've sensed that happening. Many of my colleagues in New York have, you know, left New York. At least I'm hoping temporarily, but people, definitely musicians, have spread out during this pandemic as well. I think that was common.
Now, for some courts in these times, they would furlough the musicians, but musicians were never paid in full in the court system. much of their salary, because it didn't need cash flow, they needed commodities. And so money that was supposed to be their salary would be retained by the court, and they would get their 5% interest on it. And that would be used for a pension later in life, or for a family should they die, or anything like that, which is wonderful. But on the other hand, it made them company men. They couldn't leave. If they left, they wouldn't get all the money that had been kept behind by the courts. And so the less involved you were in a court, the more flexibility you had to go elsewhere. Otherwise, you would just have to stay and suck it up and hope for the best, that things would get better.
Great. Any other thoughts from our audience or from the panel?
I'd like to ask Carrie more about the letting the choristers go, and so it's easy to read about them. I'm going to let you go for 2 years. Were they paid? Did they have some kind of support? Just you wonder how they deal with real life in the world when they are sent away for extended periods of time.
Well, the specific group of singers I was talking about in Oxford at Magdalen College, these were the boys. So these were the boy sopranos. And of course, they weren't paid. They were supplied with education, they were supplied with shoes and food and drink, and they went through huge amounts of shoes and socks. I don't know, those boys must have been running in the streets dancing. But so they basically got room and board and got their training. And during the bubonic plague, when it was, they didn't want, that could take out that whole group of boys very easily. They would send them home for these extensive periods. And they had a sort of skeleton crew of adult singers who were willing to take the risk, and they got extra compensation. But yes, of course, with child choristers, that's a bit more problematic, because 6 months is a long time when you're a 12-year-old boy whose voice is starting to change, who's just learning serious music theory, who's, sort of coming to terms with these physical differences in your voice. You wonder whether some of them might not have come back. 6 months is a long time when you're a boy.
Yeah.
So yes, it was a disruption, and sometimes they said, yes, this has to happen. Certainly these very high mortality diseases like the bubonic plague, they would gladly send away whole groups of singers. The brave or the reckless would stay.
Some of this reminds me of there's the famous letter that Johann Sebastian Bach wrote to Georg Erdmann, expressing his dissatisfaction about his situation in Leipzig. And rather than complaining about people dying, he's complaining about not enough people dying because of the money that he made from having the boys and performing at funerals. He said, now when a healthy wind is blowing, I lose a lot of money that would normally come in.
Yes.
So, there's a damned if you do and damned if you don't.
And I think in London during these 2 years that I was studying, there was a bit of that balance. On the one hand, musical life was so rich, and most people were not dying, but it was an uncomfortable balance, wasn't it? And I can see where Bach is coming from in that that extraordinary letter. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank all of you so much. This has just been so illuminating, and thank you to our audience for joining us. Lauren Ishida has just shared with us in the chat, if you'd like to read more about this very, very distinguished panel, she shared the link to our page where we have their biographies on clarionsociety.org. And I'll also mention that the Educational Week continues, and all of our events are listed on that same page. So I do hope that many of you will join us either in person or online. You can watch all of the events directly through our website. This is the only event that's on Zoom. Everything else is just directly on clarionsociety.org. On Friday, we have a harpsichord masterclass with Eric Mills, begins at 4:30 p.m. And on Saturday, June 5th, at 1:30, a cello masterclass with Myron Lutsky. And on Saturday at 5 p.m., a chamber concert with students from the master classes that will be led by our program director, Jude Ziliak. So thank you so much. Thank you to our wonderful panel, Gregory, James, Carrie, Nora. So wonderful to meet you and to hear you. And I hope we can continue this conversation and have other conversations sometime very soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Thanks so much.
Everyone.